All right, so today we're going to dive into something that might seem kind of counterintuitive at first.
Yeah.
This whole idea of freedom and tradition.
Yeah.
And how those two things actually go hand in hand.
Yeah.
Particularly when we're looking at it from a conservative perspective.
Right.
We're going to be using Yuval Levin's essay, Freedom, Tradition, and the Conservative Disposition, as our main guide here.
Yeah.
To really understand how conservatives see this connection between valuing individual liberty and also respecting those traditions that have been passed down. You know?
Yeah. Levin's essay really gets into the heart of this whole dynamic, how these two things that we might think of as being kind of at odds with each other can actually work together.
Exactly. And that's really what we're hoping to unpack in this deep dive.
Yeah.
This idea that a truly free society isn't just about getting rid of all the old rules and restrictions.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually more about being rooted in tradition in a way that maybe isn't immediately obvious.
Right.
And a big part of that is this conservative idea that freedom isn't just about a lack of limits. It's about having the ability to actually live a good life.
Yeah, exactly.
And Levin argues that tradition actually plays a really important role in making that possible.
I think that's a really key point.
So to kick things off, I guess the big question here is, what does freedom really have to do with tradition?
Right.
Like when you just hear those two words next to each other, it almost feels like they're opposites.
Right.
Yeah.
You would think so, right?
Freedom's all about choices and doing your own thing. Tradition's about following established ways of doing things.
Exactly. Yeah. That's the tension that Levin starts with, and it's a really important one.
Yeah.
Because, on the one hand, you have freedom, which we usually think of as, like you said, no constraints. The ability to make your own choices without anybody, telling you what to do.
Right.
But then on the other hand, there's tradition, which is all about these customs and beliefs and practices that have been passed down. And the idea that, there's some wisdom in the way things have been done in the past, and maybe we shouldn't just throw all that away.
Right.
And Levin even quotes Hayek, the famous economist who said that, a successful free society will always, in large measure, be a tradition-bound society.
Wow. That's a pretty powerful statement coming from someone who's so closely associated with the idea of individual liberty.
Right. It really makes you think, doesn't it?
It does. It does.
Yeah.
So Levin argues that this initial impression that freedom and tradition are somehow opposed to each other is really only part of the story.
Yeah.
He sees them as being much more interconnected, actually interdependent even.
Mm-hmm.
So how does he explain that idea of them relying on and strengthening each other?
Well, he basically says that tradition provides this really important foundation, almost like a moral and social framework that enables individuals to use their freedom in a way that's actually responsible and productive.
Okay, so it's not just about having freedom, it's about knowing what to do with it.
Exactly. And think about it. Just being free from rules isn't really enough to guarantee that a society is going to thrive or even that individuals are going to live fulfilling lives.
Right.
People need some kind of internal compass, some shared sense of what's right and wrong, and the ability to kind of govern themselves. And that's where tradition comes in.
Okay.
It provides these established norms and values, these common understandings that help people make sense of their freedom and use it in a way that's actually beneficial.
So without that kind of framework, Levin's suggesting that a society where everyone's just doing whatever they want could actually become pretty chaotic pretty quickly.
Exactly, and that chaos would eventually threaten everyone's freedom.
Yeah, it's almost like the rules of the road, right?
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Like they might seem restrictive, but they actually allow everyone to drive safely and get where they need to go.
Exactly, and Levin, he uses this really interesting phrase. He says that for freedom to endure, people need to be decent.
Decent. What does he mean by that?
Well, I think he's getting at this idea that people need to have a certain level of moral character. They need to be capable of making good choices even when no one's forcing them to. And he sees tradition as being a really important part of cultivating that decency.
Yeah, so it's not just about external laws telling you what you can't do.
Right.
It's about internalizing those values that guide you towards what you should do.
Exactly.
So how do those values actually get instilled in people?
Well, Levin talks a lot about the role of institutions in this process.
Okay.
Things like families, religious communities, schools, all sorts of community groups. He sees these as the primary ways that traditions are passed down from one generation to the next.
Okay.
And when these institutions are functioning well, he argues that they shape people's character and values without having to resort to force. They instill a sense of responsibility, they cultivate good habits, they foster a sense of belonging,
Yeah.
and all of that contributes to creating individuals who are capable of handling freedom wisely.
So it's this kind of subtle but powerful influence.
Exactly. He uses this great phrase, shape people without coercing to form, without deforming.
I like that.
Yeah, it's a nice way of putting it.
So for someone listening who might think that tradition is all about restriction and limiting people's choices,
Right.
what would Levin say they're missing?
I think he would say that they're overlooking the way that tradition actually equips us with the tools we need to handle freedom responsibly.
Okay.
It's like, those traditions might seem limiting on the surface, but they're actually giving us the moral understanding, the social skills that we need to navigate the complexities of freedom without, falling apart or hurting ourselves or other people.
Yeah.
It's not just about saying no, it's about giving people the capacity to make good choices.
Okay, that makes sense. So this whole idea of tradition being essential for responsible freedom kind of leads into a core conservative skepticism towards this idea of like completely unfettered individualistic freedom, right?
Exactly. Conservatives, they tend to be pretty wary of this notion that if you just let people do whatever they want, everything will magically work out for the best.
Yeah.
They recognize that human nature is a lot more complex than that, and that our desires can sometimes conflict with each other and with the good of the community as a whole.
Yeah.
So Levin points out that conservatives tend to be more skeptical of the individual in their approach to pursuing justice.
What does that mean exactly?
Well, it means they don't just assume that whatever an individual wants is automatically good or just.
Right.
They recognize that our impulses can sometimes lead us astray.
Yeah.
And that we need some kind of external guidance to help us make good choices.
Okay.
And they see tradition as a source of that guidance.
So it's not just about being free from external rules imposed by the government.
Right.
It's also about having that internal self-governance.
Exactly. And Levin even talks about this idea of the tyranny of unrestrained desire and vice as being kind of a counterpart to the more traditional idea of tyranny as, oppression from the outside.
So our own desires can actually become tyrannical.
Exactly, if we let them run wild.
Wow, okay. So in this view, genuine liberty isn't just about not having external limitations.
Right.
It's about having the internal capacity to choose well.
Exactly, to align your own will with what's good and right.
Now, when we talk about tradition, it's easy to kind of get this image of like rigid rules and resistance to any kind of change.
Yeah, for sure.
But that doesn't seem to be what Levin's arguing for here.
No, not at all.
So how does he actually describe the role of tradition?
Well, he emphasizes that tradition from a conservative perspective isn't about blindly clinging to the past.
Okay.
It's more about building on the accumulated wisdom and experience of previous generations.
Okay.
He actually quotes Edmund Burke, the famous conservative thinker, who said that society is a partnership between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are to be born.
Wow, that's a really interesting way of putting it.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah, so we're not just making things up as we go along.
Right.
We're inheriting this vast body of knowledge and practices that have been tested and refined over time.
Exactly. And so adhering to tradition in this sense isn't about being stuck in the past.
Mm-hmm.
It's about drawing on that inheritance as we move forward.
Okay, so it's more about gradual adaptation and improvement than like sudden radical breaks with the past.
Exactly. And Levin, he argues that tradition isn't necessarily opposed to change.
Okay.
It's more about a particular way of approaching change.
Okay.
It's a way that's marked by humility,
Humility.
Yeah, recognizing that we don't have all the answers.
Right.
And that we shouldn't be too quick to just tear down everything that's come before us. Because these traditions, they've often developed over very long periods of time.
Yeah.
Through a process of trial and error.
Right.
And they embody a kind of practical wisdom that we would be foolish to just ignore.
So it's more about adapting and refining what we've been given than assuming we can just start from scratch and create something perfect based on, whatever the latest theory is.
Right. And this connects really directly with another key aspect of conservative thought, which is this understanding of human nature as being inherently imperfect, but capable of improvement.
Right. So how does that view of human nature kind of shape this conservative perspective on freedom and tradition?
Well, conservatives, they recognize that we're all fallible. We make mistakes. But they also believe that we're capable of learning and growing.
Okay.
So instead of trying to create some kind of utopian society overnight,
Yeah.
they tend to favor more cautious incremental approaches
Okay.
that build on what's worked in the past and try to learn from past mistakes.
So it's more about evolution than revolution.
Exactly. And they see society as a kind of ongoing experiment,
Uh-huh.
a canvas of trial and error over time,
I like that.
where we inherit solutions that have generally worked and then we modify them as needed to meet new challenges.
So these traditions are like the distilled lessons learned from these long-term societal experiments.
Exactly. And Levin suggests that it's through this slow and often messy process of developing traditions that societies figure out how to live together, how to grapple with these big questions about justice and order and the good life.
Yeah.
And by respecting that inheritance, by learning from the mistakes of the past,
Uh-huh.
we avoid having to constantly reinvent the wheel.
Right.
We benefit from that collective wisdom that's embedded in these practices.
And that brings us back to this core idea of the interdependence of freedom and tradition.
Exactly.
Freedom allows for innovation and exploration,
Right.
while tradition provides that stable framework, that guidance that helps us avoid making the same mistakes over and over again.
Exactly. And in the end, Levin argues that freedom isn't just about the absence of restraints.
Mm-hmm.
It's about the capacity to live well.
Okay.
And that capacity is nurtured and sustained by a vibrant and evolving tradition.
So to sum it all up, Levin is really making the case that freedom and tradition aren't these opposing forces.
Right.
They're actually deeply intertwined.
Yeah.
And that tradition provides this ethical and institutional framework that allows individuals to use their freedom in a way that's responsible and beneficial.
Exactly. And that a healthy amount of freedom allows traditions to adapt and stay relevant over time.
So it's this really dynamic relationship
It is.
where tradition isn't just a rigid set of rules.
Right.
It's a living heritage that offers guidance and stability
Yeah.
and ultimately supports a flourishing free society.
I think that's a really good way of putting it.
So as we wrap up here, I think it's worth considering how this whole idea of societal learning and the wisdom embedded in traditions might apply to the issues that we're facing today.
Yeah.
All the debates that are going on in our society.
Yeah.
How could looking at those issues through the lens of tradition and accumulated wisdom maybe offer us a fresh perspective?
Right. How do we balance this desire for progress with the need to preserve those things that have proven to be valuable?
Exactly.
And how do we even know which parts of our tradition are worth holding on to and which parts might need to be adapted or even left behind?
It's a tough question, but I think Levin's essay gives us some really valuable tools for thinking about it.
I agree.
So I hope this deep dive is giving you some food for thought.
Me too.
And maybe even spark some new insights into this complex relationship between freedom and tradition.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Until next time.
See you later.